guilty of attempted criminal trespass and loitering, and I'm going to point you to the evidence, and I'm going to ask you to find me guilty. Very specifically, you heard from Chief Master Sergeant Ramsey about the layout of the fencing and of the structure of the barricades that were used to not allow people to get in. They were specifically designed and intended to prevent people from the outside to get in. There was a, yards and yards and yards and yards of barricades. There was yards and yards and yards and yards of tape. They were linked to the fence, like Chief Master Sergeant Ramsey said, and specifically designed to keep people like John Avedon out of that area. Was specifically what their intent was. Mr. Avedon climbed on top of the barricade, and it's not a question whether he climbed on top of the barricade. It's a question really about what his intent was. He even admitted himself that he climbed on top of the barricade. And let's think really about what the testimony was in this case, Judge. If you think about it, there wasn't a single shred of anything that was consistent other than Brad Baker's testimony. And defendant, to their credit, they don't have to do anything. Mr. Avedon, Ms. Manley could have sat in their chairs and played words with friends with each other on their iPhone, and the burden would have been mine alone. But they chose to call witnesses. They chose to put on evidence, and now it's fair to comment. They couldn't get the witnesses couldn't. They were all over the place, Judge. They were all over the place, and they were all wrong. Maureen Armand didn't see how long he was on the fence. Admittedly didn't see him the whole time. Wasn't sure the direction he was facing. The direction of the, then said, thought it was the direction of the driveway. And, she's friends with Mr. Avedon. Mr. Forsyth, he was, by his own admission, wrong. Mr. Forsyth was 85% sure. He said under direct that two people pulled Mr. Avedon off the barricade. He said two people pulled him off, and then when the video clearly showed, the pictures clearly showed that he was wrong, he conceded to that fact. Judge, if he's wrong on that fact, which is so simple, that how many people pulled the defendant off the barricade, what else is he wrong about? Well, he says that he, Mr. Forsyth must have the best vision of any peripheral vision of any person in the Western Hemisphere, because he was able to see, he was able to get zoomed in on Brad Baker, and then he was able to see all the people that were moving what's been described as, a few dozen yards away, who were on the other side of a fence, namely the people from the 174th. And then, while he was filming them, and while he was looking at them, he was able to keep track of Mr. Avedon, who apparently was walking on this fence. It's simply, it's either he's wrong again, or it's the greatest vision, that anyone's ever had. I would submit to you, he's just completely off base. And he's actually inconsistent with the first witness, who recalls him standing facing towards the congregation, this congregated group. He's not wrong on something small. He's wrong on something enormous. And I would say that you should discredit his testimony. Everything in his testimony was on the periphery, except he knew exactly where John Avedon was. Think about that for a second, Judge. said that he was specifically facing the crowd, although we know that's not true from the videotape. And then he had a few statements which, you know, think about it, Judge. When you want to credit his testimony, think about it. He says, I think I saw him basically get up. Don't remember how far he moved. Don't remember how long he was up there. Between a couple seconds and a couple minutes. So that leaves, you know, like 115 seconds. You know, knew why, interestingly, he knew that Mr. Amidon was getting on the barricade. Why? Which is interesting. Not really sure how he knew that. But he commented about how he has known Mr. Amidon for 8 years. And he's between 50 and 200 times. You know, that's someplace between 6 and 15 times a year. So sometime between once every 2 months and once every 3 weeks. For 8 years. He sees them a lot. They're friends. It's probably more than I've seen my parents in that time. Mr. Looker said that he doesn't remember what's on the sign that he was carrying. He was carrying a sign, doesn't remember what's on it. Doesn't remember what he was wearing. And doesn't know how long Mr. Amidon was on the barricade before he was arrested. You know, in all of this, Judge, what I find to be the most interesting thing is what we do know. And what we do know is that Brad Baker was looking directly at John Amidon. The reason we know that is by looking at the video. When you look at the video that Mr. Forsyth took, watch it again. When he zoomed in on Brad Baker, look exactly where Brad Baker's looking. He's looking right at John Amidon. He's looking directly to the spot that he's going to walk and arrest John Amidon a second later. You know how quick it happened. It happened like that. And he climbed up there and looked like he was going to climb over. And came dangerously close to it. He was standing on what's been described as a plastic barricade that was filled with water that was a little bit wider than this railing, which is about as wide as my hand. Handful of inches. And we know what he was wearing. We know it was this. Now, defense counsel wants to say that oh, it was included in the permit, and that it was included in the permit because it allowed protesters and people demonstrating to It allowed protesters and people demonstrating to basically use symbology. But what did it specifically say, Judge? It specifically said, in parentheses, cardboard. It used the phrase cardboard. Judge, not cardboard. Not in any way, shape, or form cardboard. Feel it, touch it, look at it, it ain't cardboard. It's plastic and it's cloth. That's not what was intended by the protection of that permit. What was intended was the carrying of the caskets and all of those other things. Take a look at the mask, because it's not covered by the permit. Judge, I'd ask you to take a look at the evidence, and I'd ask you to think about what was happening at the time it was happening. There was chants of arrest war protesters, and there was you know, a great number of people, and then a person climbs up on the fence, and Brad Baker didn't have the opportunity to allow for time to see if the defendant was going to jump over. Why? Because if you think about it for a second, Brad Baker's below the defendant. Brad Baker isn't going to negotiate with the defendant because he's below him. Why? He's at risk in that way. He's not going to negotiate with him. Why? Because he can't see his face. He's wearing a cloak. He could be armed. Thank God Mr. Amadon wasn't, but he could have been. You know, all of these things. You know, he's charged with an attempt of criminal trespass. Don't hold me to the high burden of proving that he's guilty of criminal trespass. Hold me to the burden that it's an attempted criminal trespass. Because, Judge, I think when you look at this evidence, you look at it, look at what Brad Baker saw when he testified to, Chief Master Sergeant Ramsey's testimony, and you look at common sense, you can tell that he was trying to jump over the fence. And that's what it is, Judge. And Judge, I'd ask you to find him guilty of attempted criminal trespass.